welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses that wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. So it is the day after. I'm recording this the morning after Election Day. I figured it was important to hop on the microphone and talk a little bit about sort of what just went down in Florida's elections, how it sort of fits in the national picture, what it means going forward. You know, I haven't actually prepared a script for this or anything like that. I got a couple of notes in front of me that I'll probably refer to about a couple of points that I wanted to make. But, you know, for the most part, this is going to be a lot of sort of thinking aloud and weaving, as the guy says, probably from time to time. So apologies in advance for the as you might hear as I sort of work through some of my thoughts about this. And I suspect just about everybody here listening knows the top line results in Florida were just another sea of red in Florida, is about as a Republican a result as you could have imagined. You know, right down starts at the top, Donald Trump winning the state by, I think it was 13 points. You know, it was the polls closed as soon as the polls closed, the networks called the state for Trump. And, you know, not that anybody expected him not to carry the state, but he was at the much as he was nationally at the very sort of top end of his margin, potential margin, or what everybody thought was possible. You know, but that was just sort of the beginning. You know, Rick Scott, U.S. Senator Rick Scott, the former governor, a guy who, to my knowledge, has never before had an election more than about a point difference. He just won by double digits. He had the same margin as Trump, basically winning by, I think it was like 13 points. You know, it was just up and down the ballot, a sea of red. One of the big election stories we were interested in, me particularly as someone who pays attention to the Florida legislature, was whether or not Republicans would retain their supermajority in the state House of Representatives. And you know, we've written about this before. That's important for a whole lot of reasons. You know, it gets into the minutia of legislative procedure, which, you know, sounds about as interesting as watching paint dry, but I assure you is actually quite important in terms of establishing guardrails and sort of what the leadership of the legislature can hide, not only from the public, but from its own members. So there was a question. Democrats needed to flip 5 seats to end the Republican supermajority in this House. Instead, Republicans expanded their majority. If I'm doing my math right, Democrats successfully flipped 1 seat, but Republicans flipped 2. So I think we're going to end up at roughly an 85-35 House majority in the Florida House of Representatives. So Republicans not only retained their supermajority, but strengthened it even more. You know, obviously I think probably the 2 most closely watched things on the ballot, Amendment 3, which would have legalized marijuana, and Amendment 4, the one we've talked a lot about on this show in recent weeks, the amendment that would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban and prohibited further government interference with abortion access. Both of them failed to pass, although because of a uniquely Florida thing that we'll get into, where constitutional amendments have to get 60% of the vote. I checked the results. I think Amendment 4, the abortion rights amendment, got 57% of the vote. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. Amendment 3, the marijuana initiative, got just under 56% of the vote. That was sort of an interesting result in the sense that I think the conventional wisdom going into the election is folks felt that Amendment 3, the marijuana amendment, was more likely to pass of the two, but it ended up trailing the Amendment 4, the abortion rights initiative, outpaced it, although both fell short of that 60% threshold. You know, honestly, for my money, the 2 races that really jumped out at me and that kind of signified just how red this state has become were both local races. One was in Tampa, and this was the race for state attorney, the top prosecutor out there. This is one I'm sure most folks are familiar. This is where the previous state attorney, the Democrat by the name of Andrew Warren, had been suspended and removed from office by Ron DeSantis after after the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, and Andrew Warren signed on to a statement with other prosecutors saying he would not criminalize abortion. He would not criminalize doctors who provide abortions or women who seek them. And Ron DeSantis used that as a reason to suspend him and remove him from office and replace him with his sort of handpicked appointee, Susie Lopez. Well, Andrew Warren ran for his job back against Susie Lopez. So, I mean, you're talking about I think a pretty straight referendum on Ron DeSantis' decision right there. And Susie Lopez won in Hillsborough County, which is the city of Tampa, a place that, I'm not in Tampa, but you sort of generally, I think, would think of the state's big cities as more Democratic leaning than the rest of the state. But Susie Lopez won, and it honestly wasn't even all that close. It was she won by more than 5 points. And then the other one, probably the one that signifies just what a sea of red Miami in particular has become. A few weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago at this point, I did a piece just looking at some of the more interesting school board races around the state. And part of this was coming out of the primary where pretty resoundingly voters had rejected candidates supported by Ron DeSantis and Moms for Liberty, the social conservative sort of book censorship group. But some voters had rejected those candidates in the primary pretty overwhelmingly all across the state, but some had moved through to survive to runoffs in the general. And so I put together this list of 10 sort of interesting school board races to watch on the November general. And the one that was the most interesting to me was in Miami. And this is where there was an incumbent who was essentially a Ron DeSantis appointee who'd been put onto the Miami-Dade school board and was running for reelection with his support, but up against a challenger who was backed by pretty much every Democratic or progressive leaning interest group that gets involved in school board elections. I'm thinking the state Democratic Party, the state's main teachers union, Southern Poverty Law Center, which has become kind of an ideological counterweight, I think, to Moms for Liberty. Anyway, so this to me was like a really interesting race to watch. The DeSantis candidate, she won with almost 2/3 of the vote, actually more than 2/3 of the vote. I'm looking at my notes here. At last check, she had 67.9% of the vote, like more than doubling up the challenger in that race. So, to me, that if there's anything that shows just how far right Miami in particular has gone, it's probably that race. One of the most immediate top line takeaways for me, and there'll be folks that are probably far smarter about elections and campaign data and turnout data and that sort of thing. But, I think after the 2022 midterms, which was again just a red wave in Florida, and different in the sense that there seemed to be a local red wave in Florida that was not replicated nationally, whereas this case, in this election, Florida's results very much seem to have been part of a much broader national sort of surge for Republicans that I think you've got to say Donald Trump, people turning out for Donald Trump. Anyway, I think there was a question after the 2022 elections when it was a very low turnout midterm. Democrats essentially forfeited that election, it felt like. And it was sort of seen as, I think folks sort of felt that was probably a low water point. It may not be, because here you had a high turnout election and Republicans generally up and down the ballot are winning by almost the same margins. Donald Trump's margin was nearly as large as, not quite as large, but nearly as large as Ron DeSantis. And by the way, he got far more votes overall. I've got this in my notes too, so I'll scroll to it. Donald Trump got about 6.1 million votes, whereas that's about 1.5 million votes more than Ron DeSantis got in 2022. So this was a much different election, but essentially the same partisan result. So, as you sort of think through some of this, particularly in my case, where I pay a lot of attention to the Florida legislature, and where there has been just an absolute corporate capture over the number of years, and we've seen some of the most extreme sessions. To see this result was pretty surprising, particularly after those primaries, at least to me. Again, there are people that do polling and campaigns for a living, but I honestly thought Republicans or Democrats were going to pick up a couple of state house seats. I didn't know if they were going to get the 5 to end the super majority status, but the fact that it went the other way is, from where I sit, it's a pretty shocking result. But as I think through sort of some of the takeaways from this election, one of the takeaways, it might surprise folks listening to this, is pretty positive in that, one of the more distinctive elections took place locally in Orlando. And this is for folks that read the newsletter and even listen to the podcast. I think we've talked a little bit about it in some of our interviews with folks. There were some really fascinating county commission races in Orlando this year, where essentially there were three races and two in particular, but three races where there were like essentially three tourism and developer backed candidates running against three candidates who were far more grassroots. And really you can isolate two of them in particular. And for folks who want to get super granular, I'm talking about in Orange County, there was a race in the eastern side of the county where Steve Leary, a former mayor of Winter Park, was running against Kelly Semrad, a tourism professor or a university professor and an environmental activist. And then where in West Orange County, the other side of the county, where Austin Arthur, a marketing executive and anti-abortion activist, was running against incumbent Commissioner Nicole Wilson, who had been elected after essentially being an environmental attorney and activist who'd sort of earned her stripes trying to fight plans to build a developer-backed toll road through a state forest. And in those races, like I said, there was those two races in particular, there was like just an enormous discrepancy in terms of every big real estate and developer and tourism boss in town lined up behind Steve Leary and Austin Arthur in those two county commission races. We had some stories on this on the newsletter that went into some of the details, but like one of the region's big hoteliers spent more than $20,000 alone just on Steve Leary. And in both those cases, just to illustrate, before we even get into that, just to illustrate just the lopsidedness in those races, the money disparity was so overwhelming. In the Austin Arthur Nicole Wilson race, Austin Arthur raised something like more than roughly 8 times as much money as Nicole Wilson. The Steve Leary race, Steve Leary Kelly Semrad race, it was he raised more than 4 times as much as she did. And yet both Nicole Wilson and Kelly Semrad won these races, and they won them by fairly significant margins. And in the third race, which was admittedly the politics were a little bit more complicated, that pitted a pair of Democratic candidates with, let's just say, mixed records against each other. But the one that the tourism and real estate lobbies had mostly lined up behind, an outgoing state senator by the name of Linda Stewart, she lost that race as well. So this was a pretty clear repudiation of the real estate and tourism lobbies in Orlando, Florida, which, probably will not surprise you to learn are the two most powerful interest groups in Orlando. And so part of what I take away from that in those races, there was a very clear sort of economic message in that a lot of the coverage, and some of this was on my newsletter, but this was also in the Orlando Sentinel and the Winter Park Voice and Vox Populi, a publication in West Orange County. There was like a real clear focus on some of the economic issues in that race, both sort of what these candidates would do and would not do on suburban sprawl, and what they would do when it came time to, ending subsidies for the tourism industry and starting to spend some of the money we give to tourism businesses and instead start investing it in communities and local needs on transit, roads, parks, that sort of thing. And there was a lot of focus, as I mentioned earlier, on where these candidates were getting their money and just how lopsided these fundraising advantages were. And voters across the county repudiated the developer tourism candidates, and they elected the grassroots ones, or the folks more aligned on genuine economic populist issues. I think there's probably a pretty significant lesson in that. When you specifically look at this race in West Orange County, which is one of the more Orange County is a very Democratic county overall, but the western part of the county is more Republican than the rest of the county. But even there, even in that place, in a race again, she was outspent 8-1. Nicole Wilson won by, I'm looking at my notes here again, but by basically 5 points. This was not an all that close race. So I think there's a real lesson to be gleaned there in terms of that voters really are hungry for candidates, or they pay attention to candidates who will fight for them, who are not beholden to, to tie it to the name of the show, to rent seekers. I'm not going to get into sort of national politics. There's a lot more people that can do that have a better length and more in depth than I can. But like even Trump, for all the sort of Trump stuff that comes with him, has always been pretty disciplined about keeping his economic message very populist. Whether that's, I think by the end of this campaign, he was essentially promising to eliminate taxes on like vast swaths of the population. There is a separate debate to be had about whether or not Donald Trump means any of this, or whether or not the plans he offers are at all sort of reasonable and would do what he says he would do. I think one of the reasons he can drive folks that genuinely care about economic populism and economic progressivism so nuts is, you've got a guy that repeatedly runs as an economic populist whose signature achievement during his first term as president was literally a 40% tax cut for corporations, right? It is just the record does not match the rhetoric there. But again, national stuff. I think regardless, there is, when voters perceive you, at minimum, when they perceive that a candidate is on their side, when they see these people standing up to sort of the rent seekers, the big and powerful interests that are spending so much money to influence our elections. I think that really resonates, but I think it has to be meaningful. Like, to be very clear, Kelly Semrad and Nicole Wilson, the two commissioners in Orange County who overcame this stuff, they had real records to back this up. Kelly Semrad has been an environmental organizer for a long time. She has personally led a campaign to establish a rural boundary in Orange County, which, by the way, passed by an overwhelming margin last night too in Orlando. And Nicole Wilson, as I mentioned, was an environmental attorney who was deeply involved in a fight to stop a developer-backed toll road through a state forest. Ultimately, the effort wasn't successful, but she was out front working it and fighting it, and voters respected that. It's even more of a significant takeaway when you factor in that there was some of Orlando's like old guard Democratic establishment, kind of the, for lack of a better word, the chambercrat class. Like, and I'm thinking here specifically of Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, was pretty explicitly aligned with the tourism and development lobby candidates in this race. So, you had the state's best known Democrat, or I'm sorry, the city's best known Democrat, the region's best known Democrat, aligned with the developer tourism candidates, much like he has recently been aligned with the developer and tourism interests at City Hall. But even that, the voters again rejected it outright. And so I think that's a positive development, when we take a lot of encouragement from that. When voters pay attention, they really do pay attention. Another election that I think is worth flagging that sort of, I would argue, fits with this is there was a really interesting state attorney's race in Palm Beach County. And Palm Beach County is generally a pretty Democratic county, although it seems to be going more and more Republican. And in that race, a bunch of billionaires essentially tried to buy the race. We had a story about this a couple of weeks ago where essentially three giant billionaires, all of whom are supported Donald Trump, to just tie it back into this struggle with how do you sort of ensure that a candidate isn't just talking about economic populism versus actually implementing it. But anyway, these three billionaires, just the three of them, spent $500,000 on behalf of the Republican candidate in that race, who ended up raising far more than the Democratic candidate. But the Democratic candidate in that state attorney's race, Alicia Cox, still won. I think, let me check my notes here. It's close. I think she's up 49-2 to 48-4. I have no idea what the recount rules are. Probably something I should know, but that seems like a significant enough margin that she's going to pull it out, despite, again, billionaires opening their wallets in a giant way. And again, this was another case where this was an issue in that race. I mentioned we wrote a story on the newsletter kind of calling attention to this, and it literally came as just looking through fundraising reports and suddenly seeing these three billionaires who I know from like doing work into trying to understand who's funding some of these, conservative think tanks that push for things like union busting or denying access to food stamps or preventing expansion of Medicaid, those sorts of things. I recognize those names, and seeing their money all move at once into that race, I ended up writing a story about it, and this became an issue. I know both the Palm Beach Post and the South Florida Sun Sentinel, the main newspapers down there, um, they both ended up writing about this stuff too. So this was something that a lot of voters would have been aware of. And again, it shows you that I would argue it shows you that voters still do respond to candidates who champion their economic issues, who focus on economic issues, or and against candidates who are, let's say, captured by economic interests at the top, right? Who folks who, to use it again, the rent seekers. So I look at those races in Orange County and Palm Beach County, and I take some sort of encouragement there. I think there's probably some sort of template to be built out of that kind of future for folks that are interested in things like economic justice and in things like bottom up economics in terms of helping, reduce poverty and the way that can address sort of all the fall on challenges that come from that. Another thing that I think was a big factor in this race, or something that came through, and I'm going to dial this back to those Orange County races, those county commission races. As I mentioned, there was a lot of coverage of those races from different sources, from our newsletter, from local papers, even local TV stations did some work on those races. And I think what you saw is those are nonpartisan races, right? The candidates are often, that's not to say they are not partisan. In both those cases, the two main races I talked about, there was a Republican and a Democrat. But when you walk into the booth, you don't see the letter next to their name. You might have gotten some mail telling you about it or something like that, but you don't see it in the voting booth. And I think when that happens, it creates space. The partisanship, this is I think potentially, has become so deeply ingrained and so entrenched and so calcified that folks, when it's someone on their team, their mind may often close to information that doesn't sort of to non-positive information about the person on their team, that the way they deal with the cognitive dissonance of seeing something that they don't like about the candidate on their team is they just sort of refuse to, they filter out that information, or they ignore it, or they sort of find a reason to not believe it. Whereas I think people are more receptive to learning about the actual records and the actual finances of candidates when they are not partisan races. I think we've got enough evidence of that in various races. I think this, for what it's worth, and this is just a theory I'm still kind of noodling, so I'm sure there's plenty of people that can provide feedback about what I'm not thinking of. One of the sort of shocking things to me about this general election was just how different it was from the primary elections, where there seemed like to be a very sort of clear pattern of voters kind of rejecting the same sort of extremism that, I would argue that they rewarded in this general. And I think in some of those cases, there's a lot of nonpartisan races in those primaries, but in primaries too, where, the letter that you see next to the candidate might be the same, then some of that built-in kind of refusal to process, I wonder if that gets stripped out a little bit, that people again become more sort of open to neutral information about candidates, to actually learning about records and finances and plans and that sort of thing. Probably something worth thinking a bit more about. But this is all a long-winded way of leading to what I think is probably another really encouraging result from last night, in that one of the constitutional amendments on the ballot, one of the ones that the Florida legislature had put there, would have turned school board races in Florida into partisan races. So you would have started walking into the ballot, if this had passed, and seeing an R or D next to the name. And I think, I have been of the opinion that this was an attempt to try and create that same effect where many voters will suddenly just default to their own team's propaganda about these candidates, rather than sort of thinking more critically about the individuals they're voting for, and just thinking about the teams. And you can sort of see why the Florida's Republican controlled legislature might put a measure like that on the ballot in a state where partisan Republicans win big up and down the ballot in those races. That amendment did not pass. It ended up getting just under 55% of the vote, which, again, because Florida is a state with where constitutional amendments have to get 60% of the vote, it did not pass. So school board races will remain nonpartisan. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I mean, even in last night's, again, sea of red results, the school board races were a bit more of a mixed bag. I think the last I checked, we mentioned that Miami race off the top that was so lopsided, but the last I checked, a couple of even Ron DeSantis's preferred school board candidates lost in Hernando County, and let me see if I've got this in front of my notes here. Yeah, that's right. In Hernando County and Pinellas County, where there was really an interesting showdown between kind of, an ultra MAGA Moms for Liberty school board candidate and kind of a traditional moderate Republican candidate. The moderate Republican won. I think that is part of the value of keeping school board races nonpartisan. But so with that, let me flip over to a couple of the more sort of negative thoughts, because that's a good segue. I mentioned that amendment, which I don't have it from me. I think that was Amendment 1 on the ballot. I mentioned it failed, even though it got 55% of the vote. And, unfortunately, we saw pretty clearly some of the results of kind of the anti-democratic mechanisms that have been imposed on Florida. And we saw it most specifically in Amendment 4, the abortion rights ballot initiative, the constitutional amendment that would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban. This is again, as I mentioned, it got 57% of the vote. It got a higher share of the vote than Donald Trump did. It got 57.1. Donald Trump got 56.1. It got basically the same raw number of votes in Florida as Donald Trump did. Both are around 6.1 million votes at last check. And yet, Donald Trump is going to be president. The abortion rights amendment failed. And this is all because of this requirement that constitutional amendments get 60%. And also, just I should also emphasize again, Amendment 4, Ron DeSantis is going to take credit for defeating Amendment 4. Amendment 4 got 1.5 million more votes than Ron DeSantis himself did. This is something Florida voters overwhelmingly wanted, but they could not get because of this anti-democratic provision that we've added to our Constitution that says constitutional amendments have to get 60% of the vote. And this is one of those things. This is a classic sort of one of those issues that sort of sent me on my path that led me to starting up a newsletter and podcast called Seeking Rents about sort of corporate capture of Florida government. The entire reason we have a 60% threshold in Florida is because a bunch of big corporations bought that clause to the state constitution. This all came out of a constitutional initiative amendment that passed back in 2006, where there were a bunch of the state's biggest businesses were just pissed off that Florida voters had passed an amendment raising the minimum wage. And they were like really worried that there was a petition gathering strength that would have made it a lot harder to chew up rural land for suburban sprawl. They were really worried about that. So they went to the Florida legislature, a place where, there are just far too many politicians right now who are just happy to be led around by the nose by a bunch of corporate lobbyists, as long as those corporate lobbyists are making sure they got a lot of money in their campaign accounts. And they got the legislature to put a measure on the 2006 ballot that would have required, that if approved, would have required all future constitutional amendments to pass with 60% of the vote rather than a simple majority, 50% plus one. And then these same big businesses spent millions of dollars to pass this amendment. They spent money on ads, on canvassers, on all the things you do to try and pass an amendment. I published this list last night of the biggest donors, but I mean, you are talking about a who's who of like Florida power brokers, Publix, the grocery chain, the state's big sugar companies, U.S. Sugar and Florida Crystals, the home building industry, Lennar, D.R. Horton, Pulte, those sorts of companies, CSX, the railroad giant, Universal Studios gave a bunch of money to this. There's just an absolute who's who of corporate sort of giants in Florida funded this initiative, and they got it passed. In 2006, voters after this campaign approved this constitutional amendment requiring all future constitutional amendments to pass with 60% of the vote. And the fucking irony of it all is this 2006 constitutional amendment didn't even get 60% itself. It also got something like 57% of the vote, right? But it passed because it was playing under just straight up majority wins rules here, And so, you look at Missouri passed an abortion rights amendment ballot initiative last night too with 54% of the vote. Montana voters just enshrined abortion protections into their state constitution, which passed with 57% of the vote. So the same same threshold becomes law in Montana, but it goes in the garbage bin in Florida because, CSX and Universal were worried about, potentially paying taxes, or Big Sugar didn't want to be forced to pay more money to clean up the Everglades, that sort of thing. Uh, if there's a silver lining here, the number of votes that Amendment 4 got potentially creates, you could argue it creates pressure that, I mean, it shows that there's a whole pile of Florida voters that are really upset about or not supportive of the state's near total abortion ban. Maybe that creates some sort of momentum to to make changes around there, or to, at the very least, slow down any sort of further expansion of that. Although there's going to be countervailing forces. Ron DeSantis is going to try and run for president again. And as we've seen, that run is going to be oriented entirely around winning a Republican primary, right? And sort of, unless sort of something changes in Republican Party dynamics, and after yesterday, I fail to see any potential reason for why things might change. That's going to be trying to be as MAGA as possible in order to get, out MAGA all other challengers, right? And so, I do think there's a very real possibility that Florida tries to pass a complete abortion ban sometime in the next year or two. But having this result where to show that 6.1 million Floridians voted to overturn the state's current abortion ban, could be sort of a powerful countervailing argument in that debate to come. But this result also sort of crystallizes kind of the impact of gerrymandering in Florida. And speaking of kind of the anti-democratic sort of mechanisms we've set up in Florida, right? We've talked about this in the newsletter. There's 160 seats in the Florida legislature, 120 in the state house, 100, and another 40 in the state Senate. This year, there was at best 15 or so that were competitive. At best, 1 in 10. And you look at the results that you have, you probably would have narrowed that number down even more. And that's because these seats are so aggressively gerrymandered that the vast majority of them are uncompetitive for one party or the other. This is why you have a legislature that is so much more extreme than the states. That there's, 75 Republicans in the state house whose only real concern is Republican primary voters, which are this is the most extreme of the extreme, the most partisan of the partisan are who votes in these primaries. And that's who they're concerned about. Those are the people that elect them and who they have to worry about, who might throw them out of office, right? And so this is how you end up gerrymandering is how you end up in a state where, 57% of voters want to end government interference with abortion, and yet the state's legislature has imposed a near total abortion ban. It's because the incentives are the political incentives are all out of whack when you've got these districts drawn in such a way as to render them non-competitive in general elections. And, as we think through what Florida means nationally, obviously anybody who's not familiarized themselves with the Project 2025 agenda probably get up to speed real quick, because that blueprint is coming. And, there's been this kind of talking point in Florida that Florida is Project 2025 is Florida 2024, because a lot of these ideas have already been imposed in Florida, particularly over the last 2 years. And very much so by the Heritage Foundation. That's the billionaire-backed think tank that's, was behind Project 2025. But, as I think through what like Florida might be modeling for the rest of the nation is a lot of these, these sort of anti-democratic tactics in Florida. You might see some of those more replicated nationally. That is one of my bigger fears coming out of this. And sort of to that end, the other thing I'm really worried about, having watched the Amendment 3 and Amendment 4 campaigns, we saw something that I've been doing this for more than 20 years now, and we saw something that we never have in the past, where the DeSantis administration essentially weaponizing all layers of state government against both Amendment 3 and Amendment 4, the abortion and weed constitutional amendments, and throwing tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money into these fights, using tens of millions of dollars taxpayer monies to essentially campaign against these amendments. We've obviously written a lot about this in the newsletter. This was where I ended up spending a lot of my time. Election coverage was just sort of prying into trying to answer some of the questions of, how much was the administration spending and where they're getting that money, and we've already got pretty good idea that they spent at least $20 million. And there have been estimates by the Amendment 3 campaign estimated $50 million working backwards from the value of the TV airtime. But it is a giant number of taxpayer money spent to fight amendments that were both overwhelmingly popular, 57 and 50, 55 or 56%. I forget Amendment 3 off the top of my head, but 55 or 56, But, all those voters that voted for those two ballot measures, their money was used to run ads against them and to campaign against them. And, right down to taking opioid settlement money that the state of Florida got from the manufacturers and distributors of opioids, the companies that profited off the opioid epidemic. This money is supposed to be going into abating the opioid crisis and burning that money for essentially what were political ads against ballot measures that were supported by, sizable majorities of Florida voters. I mean, that's really like just beyond the pale. Like I said, there are plenty of constitutional amendments that Jeb Bush and Rick Scott opposed, but they never weaponized the state in this way to campaign against them. And I am really concerned that there's not going to be any accountability around this. One of the hallmarks of the Florida legislature this last few years and Florida courts have been a willingness to allow the DeSantis administration to essentially get away with almost anything. In very few cases have there been meaningful accountability or oversight imposed on the administration. Not to say it's never happened, but it generally has not. And even in as these campaigns unfolded, various legal efforts to try and sort of stop this kind of government meddling in what were supposed to be these free and fair amendment elections, courts consistently refused to get involved. They always found technicalities to not to take up the ripe disputes. It ultimately fell on a federal judge just to stop the administration from threatening TV stations with criminal penalties for running pro Amendment 4 ads, right? I mean, this stuff was crazy that was happening. And so, it's going to be incumbent on probably Republican members of the Florida legislature, if any of them care to stand up for any of this, to put a stop to this. Like I think of a guy like Joe Gruters, the state senator who's going to run for CFO and was so front and center on the Amendment 3 campaign. Is he gonna use his position of authority in any way to try and demand like real answers about what exactly was spent here, where that money came from, and try and sort of enforce any sort of accountability? I sort of doubt it. And again, I worry about this model becoming even more of a template for nationally, where you can run roughshod. I mean, one of the chilling things about the Trump election is he was very explicit about DOJ wanting the Department of Justice to be sort of a directly controlled agency and stuff like that. So we're about to see what that means, and you're starting to see, one of the things we learned in these campaigns is the way you might not even think we're not even thinking about ways that this stuff might manifest. I don't think going into the election, let me say it. I myself did not think going into this election that we were going to look at $20+ million of state spending on campaign ads against two citizen-led petition drives. That was not something I had on my bingo card. And so it's a reminder that, when you start to allow this kind of what I would genuinely call abuses of power to take root, it's going to lead to things that you're not even thinking of right now. I'm not even thinking of right now. So, we're in for a ride. The last thing I think I wanted to talk about, or at least relation to these elections, is kind of looking ahead. And I'm going to, again, keep this as Florida specific as possible. There's, we're in for a ride nationally, obviously. And so a lot of folks are better equipped to sort of talk about what might be coming down the pike there. But a couple of interesting things that came out of this election. So here's, when I think through one of the more interesting local races, there was a big local election in Palm Beach County to decide partisan control of the county commission. The Democratic candidate ended up winning that race, and it wasn't all that close. Although, again, you sort of think of Palm Beach County as a pretty Democratic county. So, Republicans were working uphill on here. It's tough to read too much into that result in terms of, Republicans probably did better than I suspect if you cracked inside the numbers, you'd find out they did better than you might have expected just because of the sort of, again, the conservative wave factor. Um, but one of the more interesting things in that election was how Ron DeSantis and Big Sugar ended up kind of aligned for the same candidates. You sort of, in my mind, you think of Ron DeSantis has kind of been famously antagonistic towards the state's big sugar industry. This is, to sort of tie it back to one of the earlier stream of conversation we were having there about, candidates who talk about who pretend to be economic populists or care about economic justice or bottom up economics versus how they actually govern is the same old trickle down shit we've been dealing with for decades. This was at least one place where Ron DeSantis's record seemed to largely, not entirely, but largely match up with his rhetoric, where he had pretty consistently, again, not always, but pretty consistently stood up to the sugar industry, particularly on issues involving the Everglades. But I think there's a current of thought out there that might be changing. And so this race was interesting to see them aligned, particularly because there's a number of issues that could come up. There's more Everglades issues. There's still there are going to be fights over, who gets control of water in Lake Okeechobee, which is necessary for, restoring parts of the Everglades, but the sugar industry uses it for irrigation. There is, and this is what we had alluded to in our story. There's a battle that seems to be brewing over whether or not to allow rock mining in the Everglades, or I'm sorry, in the Everglades agricultural area, where it sure looks like the DeSantis administration may be aligned with the sugar industry on that. It's not entirely clear yet, but it seems to be so far, and that could be a big fight coming down the pike. So, and you layer that into the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, Ron DeSantis, it seems pretty clear, is going to run for president again. And he's going to go looking for money again. And another thing, and we'll unpack more of this in the future, is there was quite a bit of dark money flowing into some of these amendment campaigns. And I'm thinking specifically of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the state's biggest big business lobbying groups, and whose political operation is largely funded by Florida Power and Light and the two big sugar companies and a handful of other big companies, but them particularly. But they also have a dark money entity that really seemed to ramp up its spending. I gotta crack inside the numbers to know how much it ramped up. But there's part of me that wonders, are we getting sugar and utilities sort of, are they developing a deeper relationship with the DeSantis administration, and are they doing it in a way that makes it harder to see? So I think that's going to be a really significant story to watch over the next 2 years, especially. And there'll be ways, there'll be plenty of Lord knows that the FPL and sugar are never out of issues to lobby for. So there'll be a lot of places to see to put this to the test, to see where DeSantis falls, if he remains kind of the same, stand up to big sugar guy he was before, or if we're looking at, this new Ron DeSantis running for president, if that's a different guy. So I think that's a really significant story to watch in Florida politics. Another storyline to watch. So we had a show a little while ago that about we talked to a city commissioner from Gainesville about a local referendum there involving the state's public utility company, GRU, Gainesville Regional Utilities, which had been city owned and run by the city, and then the legislature stepped in and sort of seized control of it and gave it to Ron DeSantis. Voters ended up passing a referendum in Gainesville yesterday by more than 70% of the vote to essentially take control back from that governor appointed body, from the governor. After we taped that show, there was a court ruling that sort of came out where the court had sort of enjoined enforcing this referendum until they can sort of litigate through some of the issues. So the referendum passed. It doesn't mean nothing happens right now. Now it just means this issue will get litigated now that the referendum has passed. So it's not a done deal, but it was, more than 70% of voters passed this. But right before it did, there was a story, and I think it was Politico Florida that had it, where one of the Republican legislators who had most been beating the drum to essentially take control of GRU away from the residents of Gainesville and give it to the governor instead, he had made a remark that like this fight, if it kept escalating, might prompt the Florida legislature to dissolve the city of Gainesville, which is just a crazy thought when you think about it. But it is also something, and we have talked about this before, this isn't something that is coming down the pike. So the escalation of preemption in Florida, of this gerrymandered Florida legislature stepping in and stripping away the abilities of local communities to make their own decisions, to control their own assets, to be in control of their own futures. The escalation of this is reaching to the point where we might see something truly dramatic. I would argue that taking away control of the local utility company from local voters itself was one of these dramatic escalations. But if folks might remember that there was a big fight in Key West a couple of years ago where the voters of Key West passed a couple of initiatives overwhelmingly that were meant to stop giant cruise ships from docking in the port, limit the size and number of visits from large cruise ships in the port in part because of the sort of the environmental destruction they caused the coral reef, also because of sort of the number of tourists they dump on the city and sort of the value of those tourists versus the value of drive-in market folks. After voters passed those amendments, the cruise industry and the owner of the city's cruise pier went to the legislature in DeSantis and got them to overturn those results and essentially pass a law preempting Key West from doing any kind of port regulations itself. This was a big fight. It made people in Key West furious. But in that fight, someone in the legislature drafted a bill to dissolve the city of Key West. It never got filed. I think a lot of people laughed it off as like a little joke. It was not a joke. It was a threat. This is coming. And, in an election where, as I said earlier, the Florida legislature has become an increasingly extreme place, especially the last couple of years, and just got rewarded with elections that have given it an even bigger majority. There's no reason to think this stuff won't escalate. And so I don't know if it'll be this GRU fight. Frankly, the court rulings might resolve that in a way that it becomes moot for the legislature. But the idea that the Florida legislature is going to step in and erode home rule to the point of like just outright eliminating a blue city, I think that's coming. I think that's going to be like a real kind of democratic crisis and fits with this larger sort of issue of anti-democratic stuff taking root in Florida and sort of like the anti-democratic mechanisms that have been put in place now sort of paying off, for lack of a better way to say it, in the form of, preserving an abortion ban despite overwhelming opposition to it, or, like I said, this idea that we're now threatening to dissolve cities because we don't like the policies they're passing from, folks that, at one time, when the before times were big proponents of local control and home rule. I think that is one of the more urgent stories to watch in Florida politics. And then I think just the last point to this is, I think to watch how much more extreme Florida gets. It seems pretty likely the way these results get, as we've mentioned a couple of times now, Ron DeSantis is going to run for president. He's going to take credit for defeating the abortion and weed amendments. He did not defeat the abortion and weed amendments. Taxpayers and Big Sugar essentially defeated the abortion and weed amendments between the ads that he made taxpayers pay for and that 60% requirement that, U.S. Sugar and Publix and Lennar all got put into the Constitution. That's what defeated those two amendments, not Ron DeSantis. But, he's going to spin it as a victory, and he's going to start gearing up for, thinking ahead to the Iowa caucuses in a couple of years. And, as we saw in that 2023 legislative session, especially the one right before he launched his campaign, that seems like, that whole process, the incentives around the way Republican primaries work, primaries generally, but it just seems that the furthest extreme candidates seem to be doing much better in Republican primaries than they are in Democratic primaries. That dynamic is probably going to dominate Florida politics for the next couple of years, especially, after these election results. So anyway, I have no idea how long I've been rambling about here. These were just some of the thoughts pinballing around my head. I am interested in any sort of comments anybody might have, so feel free to reach out. I'll throw my email address in the show notes. If you are watching this on YouTube, make sure to click subscribe to the show if you're interested in the content. If you've come this far, maybe leave a comment if you've got any sort of thoughts one way or the other about anything I sort of spitballed out here. Or if you're listening to this show on the podcast, also make sure to, if you haven't already, sign up for our newsletters. The easiest way to find us is seekingrentsfl.com. None of our stories or podcasts are behind a paywall. Everything is free. There is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you've got one, or if you've got the means. If you can afford it, please think about doing one of those voluntary paid subscriptions. The revenue we raise from those paid subscriptions is super important to helping us pay for, reporting expenses like the cost of public records requests, because we're always going to do a lot more digging into public record stuff over the next few weeks as we try and learn more about these campaigns, these publicly funded campaigns against Amendment 3 and 4, and as we start to gear up for the next legislative session with what I would assume will be a further emboldened Florida legislature. So yeah, again, if you've got the means, please think about doing one of those voluntary paid subscriptions. And then just check us out on our channels. Follow us on YouTube, TikTok, wherever you consume your media. All right, we're going to leave it here for now. We'll be back again soon. I'm hoping to have a guest on for a show to talk about the elections. I'm pretty excited about that if we can pull that off. But until then, thanks very much for listening. We'll talk again soon.